He was clearly Hungarian, yet he was forced to take up arms and fight for the German army. After enduring the hellish battlefield drenched in blood and fire, he finally made it to the one annual leave he'd been waiting for. Just as he lined up with joy in his heart, ready to board the train home, he was suddenly told that his name wasn't on the leave list. He pleaded desperately for the officer to double-check the list. The sergeant carefully went over the names again, but still didn't find anyone named Lombos. Without another word, the sergeant yanked Lombos out of the line. Lombos kept explaining that whoever printed the list must have accidentally left his name out. He begged the sergeant to show some kindness and let him go home, because it had been almost a year since he received a letter from his fiancée. All he wanted was to go home and see her with his own eyes. But faced with his desperate pleading, the sergeant simply handed him a piece of gauze. While Lombos stood there confused, the sergeant suddenly punched him hard in the face without warning. Then he told Lombos, "I'll find time to verify if there's a mistake with the list, but until I do, you're picking up your rifle and heading back to the front." Helpless, Lombos could only use the gauze the sergeant had given him to plug his bleeding nose. Then he queued up to collect 5 bullets and a long rifle. Disheartened, he sat silently on a bench, listening to the roaring sound of the homebound train pulling away. Unexpectedly, the sergeant came and sat beside him. He told Lombos, "Everyone wants to go home, but we are soldiers, and we must obey orders. I'll help check your name as soon as I can, but remember, as soldiers, our greatest duty is to defend our homeland." Listening to him, Lombos let out a cold laugh in his heart, because to him, being Hungarian and picking up a weapon to help the Germans invade the Soviet Union was not defending his homeland at all. Hearing Lombos' bitter retort, the sergeant said nothing. Lombos quietly stood up and walked away. That afternoon, the male soldier showed up again. Seeing his comrades receiving letters from home, Lombos fell into silence once more. Since joining the army a year ago, he had only received one letter from his fiancée during the first month. After that, she disappeared as if she had vanished from the face of the earth. That was the real reason he was so desperate to return home. His comrade always tried to comfort him with all sorts of reasons, but over time, even the comrade stopped believing the excuses he made up to soothe Lombos. That comrade was Lombos' best friend. Every time he saw Lombos depressed over his fiancée, he would do everything he could to cheer him up. But just a few days later, during a battle one evening, the comrade was killed by a Soviet sniper. Lombos turned to look at him. There was no time to grieve. He immediately launched an assault. He charged toward the Soviet position with all his might, while the enemy's gunfire blazed like serpents of fire devouring lives. As Lombos ran forward with all his strength, a shell suddenly exploded right next to him. When he opened his eyes again, the battle was over. All he saw were Soviet soldiers celebrating as they cleaned up the battlefield. He had no choice but to lie still and pretend to be dead, trying to fool them. But in the next moment, his terrible acting was quickly exposed by a Soviet soldier. The soldier waved his hand to call over others. Seeing Lombos still motionless, one of them simply unbuckled his belt and urinated right on Lombos' face. Lombos had no choice but to come back to life in humiliation. He was soon taken to a nearby train station by the Soviets. One by one, prisoners boarded the train under Soviet guard. Each prisoner was allowed one sip of water before boarding, but Lombos, parched with thirst, took an extra sip and was immediately beaten by 2 Soviet soldiers. Seeing this, the other prisoners erupted in a riot. The scene descended into chaos. Calm and composed, the Soviet commissar swiftly fired a shot into the air. Only then did the prisoners quiet down, but the 2 Soviet soldiers continued to brutally beat Lombos. The other prisoners could only squat silently on the ground, listening to Lombos' helpless and desperate cries. After that, all the prisoners were herded into the train carriages. Only the bruised and battered Lombos was left behind. The Soviet commissar said nothing. He raised his pistol, ready to execute Lombos on the spot for his disobedience. But just as he was about to pull the trigger, he suddenly realized Lombos could speak Russian. So, in order to squeeze every last bit of value out of Lombos, the commissar decided to spare his life, then send him to join a mine-clearing unit. But the so-called mine-clearing unit was, in truth, a death squad made up mostly of prisoners, sometimes joined by Soviet soldiers who had been sentenced to death. Every member of the team wore Soviet uniforms and walked ahead of the troops, stepping into minefields to clear the way for the army. Besides these deadly daily missions, they also became a cruel form of amusement for some soldiers who gambled on their lives. That day, Lombos was brought by 2 Soviet soldiers to a nearby minefield. The soldiers threw several helmets into the dangerous zone, then started betting on whether Lombos could make it back alive with the helmets. Helpless, Lombos had no choice but to walk slowly toward the helmets under the threat of their guns, while the soldiers behind him kept throwing clumps of mud to make him move faster. They even started a second bet on whether their mud would hit Lombos or not. Luckily, Lombos survived that ordeal, and so it went on, day after day. Lombos walking the line between life and death, praying silently with every step he took. To improve his chances of survival, he often sought advice from the more experienced members of the group, but he soon realized that no matter how cautious he was, sooner or later he would be torn apart by a landmine, so he made up his mind to look for a chance to escape. One day, Lombos followed the Soviet troops to a village behind the front lines for rest. The soldiers, overjoyed after days of fighting, threw a lively celebration. Many of them got so drunk they could barely stand, waiting patiently for the right moment. Lombos finally decided to make his move. He took out a rope he had secretly hidden before, tied a block of wood to one end, and quietly tossed it out through the small window above. Then he gently pulled the rope, making the block slide and finally hook onto a bench outside. But what Lombos didn't know was that the commissar was sitting right there on that very bench, watching everything he did. The commissar didn't make a sound. He just sat still, silently observing, completely unaware. Lombos happily prepared to climb out of the window and escape along the rope. Just as he was about to make it, the commissar suddenly stood up. Lombos lost his grip and fell hard to the ground. It was then he finally realized going home was nothing more than a distant dream. As punishment for trying to escape, Lombos was ordered to dig graves for 100 fallen soldiers. Although he was filled with resentment, as a prisoner he could only obey and dig day and night without rest. Before all this, Lombos had been a university professor. He not only spoke fluent Russian but was also an excellent artist. One day, he was called into the office to act as a translator during the interrogation of a newly captured German prisoner. Lombos decided to play along, to behave well and win the Soviets' trust, waiting for the moment when they would let down their guards so he could escape again. While waiting for the interrogation to begin, he used the spare time to draw a portrait of the commissar's girlfriend. The young woman looked at the portrait and accepted it happily. Soon, the interrogation began. Trying to please the Soviets, Lombos worked carefully as their translator, but when the commissar questioned the German prisoner, the man only stared at Lombos in silence, refusing to say a word. The next moment, the Soviets began a harsh interrogation. Hearing the prisoner's cries of pain, Lombos felt a deep wave of anger and sorrow in his heart. But as a captive himself, there was nothing he could do. He could only stand there quietly, watching everything unfold before his eyes. No one knew how long it took, but eventually, the German prisoner could no longer endure the brutal interrogation. In the end, he confessed everything he knew. With the information extracted, the Soviets launched a fierce assault on the German positions that very afternoon. As a prisoner, Lombos was forced to go with them, helping to row the boats across the river. The commissar stood on the shore, delivering an impassioned speech to rally the Soviet soldiers. Although they had received intelligence about the German defenses on the opposite bank, the Soviet troops who took part in the river crossing still suffered devastating losses. As Lombos rowed with all his strength, he silently prayed that the German bullets wouldn't hit him, but the next second, a shell exploded right beside him. Thrown into the river, Lombos struggled desperately, swimming with all his strength toward the far bank, away from the battlefield. He crawled up onto the shore, grabbed a rifle from the ground, and quietly moved into the tall grass. He planned to use the chaos of battle as a chance to escape, but suddenly, he heard a faint sound coming from the bushes ahead. Moving closer, he saw a German soldier pointing his gun at a Soviet female medic who had fallen into the water and barely made it to shore alive. Because Lombos wasn't truly German but Hungarian, a man who had been forced to fight in this invasion against his will in that moment of crisis, his kind nature prevailed. He chose to save the helpless woman. Without hesitation, he raised his gun and shot the German soldier, but just as he rescued the medic, a group of Soviet soldiers appeared behind him. Lombos, who had hoped to slip away unnoticed, was captured once again. To his surprise, the medic he had just saved turned out to be the younger sister of the commissar's girlfriend. So even though Lombos became a Soviet prisoner again and was sent back to the mine-clearing unit, his fate changed. He no longer had to walk in front to clear mines. Instead, he was now assigned to walk at the very back as a supervisor. The Soviet soldiers stopped tormenting him like before. Instead, they urged Lombos to join them in bullying the other prisoners in the mine-clearing squad. They ordered him to throw a wooden stick at the captives walking ahead of him as they cleared the path. But the kind-hearted Lombos refused to harm others, especially those who had once fought beside him. He threw the stick away in defiance. Seeing that, The two soldiers flew into a rage and once again turned Lombos into their target of humiliation. That afternoon, Lombos followed the Soviet troops to an abandoned train station. The ground was littered with bodies, proof that a fierce battle had just taken place there. Immediately, the Soviets went into full alert, spreading out to search the area. Then, suddenly, gunfire erupted. A fierce battle broke out once more. A sniper on the other side pinned the Soviet troops behind two train cars. To find out where the sniper was hiding, the commissar made a ruthless decision. He shoved Lombos out from behind cover. The soldiers gestured for Lombos to move forward. He knew that walking ahead meant near certain death, with a much higher chance of being shot than stepping on a landmine. But with Soviet rifles aimed at him from both sides, Lombos had no choice. He gathered what little courage he had left and began to take slow, trembling steps forward. The female medic, the one whose life Lombos had saved, watched him with deep sorrow. But as a soldier, she had no right to disobey the commissar's orders. She could only stand there in silence, watching her savior slowly walk toward danger. It was at that moment that Lombos finally realized that no matter what he did, in the eyes of the Soviets, he would always be a foreigner. Fortunately, even though the sniper had him in his sights the entire time, he didn't shoot right away. He wanted to lure out more Soviet soldiers. Only when the Soviets began to lower their guard and step out into the open did the sniper finally pull the trigger. 3 soldiers were hit one after another, including the female medic. Yet somehow, Lombos, who had been walking right at the front, survived by sheer luck. After a fierce battle, the Soviets eventually managed to eliminate the sniper. Lombos looked at the lifeless body of the female medic and fell silent. The medic's sister, the commissar's girlfriend, screamed in rage, accusing Lombos of betraying them, saying he must have warned the sniper. Otherwise, why was he the only one left alive? From that moment on, Lombos lost his privilege of staying behind the group. He was once again forced to walk at the very front, clearing mines for the Soviets. As he trudged forward, he suddenly noticed several bodies hanging from the trees ahead, and to his astonishment, standing beneath one of those trees was his fiancée, the woman he loved, who should have been thousands of miles away in his homeland. Lombos froze in confusion. He stared blankly at her, unable to say a word. His fiancée looked up and met his gaze, and in that instant, their eyes locked across the distance. For a brief, dreamlike moment, Lombos felt as if he had been pulled into a world of peace and warmth, but happiness is always fleeting. In the next second, Lombos woke up from his beautiful dream, filled with longing and despair. That dream, however, only strengthened his resolve. He would escape, no matter what it took. That afternoon, his long-awaited chance finally came. As usual, he was forced to walk at the front, clearing mines for the Soviets. From the shattered limbs scattered across the ground, it was clear that a brutal battle had recently taken place. Lombos focused all his strength and attention, moving forward carefully, afraid that one wrong step could end his life. Then suddenly, gunfire erupted. The German forces, who had been lying in ambush in the woods ahead, launched a fierce counterattack. The commissar quickly ordered his men to take defensive positions. Lombos, who had been waiting for a chance to escape, seized the moment. Since he was still wearing his Soviet uniform, he couldn't run straight toward the German lines, so he decided to flee into the forest, away from both sides. To improve his chances, he grabbed a rifle from the ground and headed toward a Soviet female medic who was helping the wounded. Because she was the commissar's girlfriend, Lombos took her hostage to ensure his escape. Even though the Soviets were busy fighting, one soldier noticed Lombos holding the medic. He raised his gun to shoot, but before he could fire, a German sniper's bullet struck him down. Taking advantage of the chaos, Lombos dragged the medic away, moving slowly toward the woods behind them. Just then, the commissar saw his girlfriend being taken hostage by Lombos and disappearing into the trees. Furious, he jumped onto a motorcycle and sped after them, but only seconds later, a bomb exploded and hurled him through the air. Lombos, seeing his chance to finally escape the battlefield, kept moving, but another explosion went off right beside him. The medic, freed by the blast, tried to draw her pistol, but before she could fire, Lombos rushed forward and knocked it from her hand, sending it flying. She scrambled on the ground, trying to grab the gun again, but Lombos kicked it even farther away. Cornered, the medic turned and kicked Lombos with all her strength, then lunged for another weapon that had fallen nearby. But before she could reach it, Lombos struck her and knocked her unconscious. He was just about to run when he saw the commissar staggering toward him, firing wildly. Dazed from the explosion, the commissar's shots missed every time. Lombos seized the moment, charging straight at him. The two men collided, wrestling in a brutal struggle for life and death. Though the commissar had been badly wounded by the explosion, his fury gave him almost superhuman strength as he fought to protect his lover. In the end, he overpowered Lambos and pinned him to the ground, pressing a knife closer and closer to Lambos's chest. Lambos struggled desperately, but in the end, the blade plunged into his chest. Miraculously, Lambos didn't die. No one knew how much time passed before he slowly opened his eyes again. A group of Soviet soldiers had found him barely alive, but these men didn't belong to the commissar's unit. They were from another division. They didn't know who Lambos was, and since he was still wearing his Soviet uniform, they assumed he was one of their own. By sheer luck, Lambos had once again survived. I'm a film enthusiast. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next episode.